Welcome to EL's webinar on Tunisia and the rise and fall of Ennahda. Recently, they've had even more troubles piled onto them through the legal process after they were removed from power last year. And to talk about this and the kind of regional picture for the Muslim Brotherhood and its affiliates, we have three experts. We have Khadija Moalla, who's a development specialist. She worked at the United Nations and in other places for the last 25 years. She's an expert in international law and focuses on issues of gender equality, the rule of law, and civil society. Hussein Ibish is a senior resident scholar, at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington. He's a regular contributor to the media and is a columnist at Bloomberg and The National. His most recent book is What's Wrong with the One-State Agenda. And Mohamed Hineidi is an expert in countering violent extremism and preventing violent extremism. He's the founder and director of the Extremist Monitoring Analysis Network, EMAN, which is a not-for-profit that exposes hate speech and radical discourse and works to counter such incitement and radicalization. If we will go first to Mohamed to start us off.
Thank you so much, Kyle. Hi, everyone. Nice to meet you all. So I just wanted to share my screen so we can begin with the presentation. Can you all see this?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. I know as well. My apologies, I'm not sure my PC seems to be acting up. Right. We've got the presentation in front of us just to confirm once again, correct?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. All right, cool. The decline of Ennahda, and so in this presentation, I'll be discussing the overall what's happened to Ennahda in Tunisia and the overall decline of political Islam or the Muslim Brotherhood across the West Asia, North Africa region. So to begin with, I'd like to talk about what happened last year, the political earthquake that occurred last year in July when Qais Said ousted Hisham al-Mishishi and froze parliament. Obviously, Ennahda was a big, as we all know, it controlled parliament at the time in a coalition. I just wanted to talk about what happened to Ennahda in the years prior to that. So I guess what I'm trying to say is it became part of the establishment, the Islamist establishment. So it wasn't just an establishment per se, it was an establishment with an ideology, which sort of makes it even worse. It failed at implementing internal reforms. So they agreed to implement they agreed to sort of complete the implementation of the constitution. Ennahda became too supportive of Hisham al-Mishishi and the political ambitions of Yusuf Shahid as well. At the time, it was indicative that they were consolidating their rule, and at least Ghannouchi was more interested in consolidating his rule and cementing his political alliances rather than steering the country and improving the lives of Tunisians, implementing reforms, decided in the 2016 Congress, fix an economy that was in free fall, and obviously address a very horrific COVID, the coronavirus cases in the country at the time. So as I mentioned briefly, it was beginning to become the Islamist establishment. And he was even beginning to get encouraged by his close inner circle to consider running for presidential elections in 2019 and in 2024. And I think this is probably what spurred Qais Said to come in and stop him from doing so. Just to talk about the economy being in free fall and rising unemployment, they were obviously compounded by the COVID crisis. The Tunisian economy contracted by over 8%. The fiscal deficit expanded to over 11%, and unemployment was around 20% by the third quarter of last year, in addition to roughly 51% of Tunisians being interested in leaving the country to go to Europe. And there was a partial collapse of the country's health system, and Tunisia, having strong state institutions, civil unions, and a very strong healthcare system, it was a bit of a wake-up call, I think, to the Tunisian people. So I think these are the three main points that I wanted to discuss about what happened to Ennahda just prior to them being ousted, and this is, the decline of the group in the country. As as a founding director of a non-for-profit that looks at hate speech and countering violent extremism, Islamists and right-wing extremists, extremism in general, I just wanted to touch base on the Islamist reaction. So as usually what would happen is the same usual suspects came out and said that they accused Qais Said of joining an international Zionist and secular forces around the world in their fight against Islam. They made it about religion. They made it about Islam versus the West, a clash of civilizations, which is not true at all, obviously. These positions, however, based on ideological explanations, failed to mobilize Tunisians against Said. Being pragmatic, as Ennahda has usually been since 2011, they came out and said, we're not interested in violence and we don't necessarily condone what these people are saying. But during their power, since 2011, there have been terrorist attacks, and there were some cases where judges that were aligned to Ennahda failed to take the necessary action against sort of terrorism cases, thousands of terrorism cases, and assassinations of secular politicians in 2013. And I think that was a very, very big deal for a country that is quite liberal, quite secular, but where Islam still plays a pretty significant role. Zooming out now, I just wanted to take a look at the decline of Islamist fortunes across West Asia and North Africa. So we've seen now in Morocco as well, the Justice and Development Party is sort of now in line with the palace. They've lost the elections last year, and I think that was the last stroke with Ennahda. We've seen them all basically lose out in North Africa at this stage. And currently as well, Turkey, which is basically the HQ for the Muslim Brotherhood, or was the HQ for the regional MB affiliated parties, has now been disengaged. And I can say that as someone with very specific knowledge of what's happening in the Gulf, even as I drive up and down the highways in Dubai, when Erdogan was in the country 2 weeks ago, we had big signs with hashtags saying UAE-Turkey strategic relations. The Turks have been disengaged from assisting ideologically and financially and even militarily Islamist factions and political parties across the region. They're more concerned now with rebuilding alliances with Egypt and the Gulf. And I think that's something that's very significant. Qatar, however, remains as sort of the primary backer of these groups across the region, despite their decline. And one last thing as well, sorry, two more things, but the strength of the regional anti-Islamist camp has really taken hold in the past 10 years since the beginning of the Arab Spring. So the alliance between Bahrain, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Morocco, and Jordan has really strengthened, which are all sort of anti-Ikhwan, anti-Islam, anti-Islamist. That alliance, its strength, in addition now to the Abraham Accords, I think has really made the Islamist camp very, very weak. And I think this could be a blow that it will take them quite a while to recover from. Also, the thawing of relations between Turkey and the UAE, ideological, perhaps two of the most ideologically ideological rivals of the region, that obviously could have been the straw that would break the camel's back when it comes to regional Islamist political parties. The view from Egypt as well, if we go to Egypt, being the most populous Arab country, and where the the MB began, where Islamists really were born. Mursi's overthrow in the region, Mursi's overthrow in 2012 was a significant setback, and I think this was sort of the snowball effect that then took place. Al-Sisi congratulated Qais Said when he froze Parliament and ousted Ennahda last year in July. It's showing now, it's beginning to show for all of us that at the end of the day, you know, political parties that infuse religion with governance are not, they're not welcome. They're basically, you know, they're showing themselves as hey, we're excellent at being in opposition, but we're quite horrible at governance and at running a country and at statecraft. And I think this is what we're really learning, and this is what we've really seen over the past decade. As I said, we're looking at Turkey now, and as I mentioned, the gradual disengagement of Turkey from supporting regional Islamist parties. I think this is something that's extremely important. You know, as geopolitically, the Turkish Emirati detente is perhaps the most significant defeat to Islamists in the region since Morsi's removal from power. Turkey's focus on fixing its economy as well, and amending relations with regional rivals is perhaps far more important to Erdogan than his support for Islamist parties across North Africa that don't seem to be heading anywhere, and that don't seem to be promising their people much in terms of governance and improving the lives of their citizens. The overview of the current state of Islamist parties. So it's important to note that they're not all a monolith. The Islamic Action Front in Jordan, for instance, is not the same as Hamas, which bases its entire sort of modus operandi on fighting Israel. Equally, Ennahda is the political party that came to power in the country that is the model child of the Arab Spring, you know, where democracy took place and took root. Equally, it's different to the Justice Development Party in Morocco. So we have to remember that they're not all the same. They're quite, you know, they're quite different, and to say that they're all in decline is a very accurate statement at this stage, but we could see them coming back sort of, you know, with some strength in the future, as they've usually always done so. I think in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, even in the 80s, the Muslim Brotherhood, we kept, you know, I think the world or the region specifically kept saying that they were sort of declining, and then they sort of kept coming back from the dead. So we could see that coming, you know, we could see that happen again in the future. But I think what's most important is that for the younger generation, the generation that went out onto the streets in the Arab Spring to remove autocrats that they've lived their entire lives, not knowing anyone else, such as Moalla, such as Zain Abidine, such as Gaddafi, when they finally saw what Islamists have to offer, they said to themselves, well, no, this is not what I want from the country. This is not what I want for my future. And we've seen a lot of these people leave their countries and head to Europe. There's been a massive brain drain. In Tunisia's case, 51% of 18 to 29-year-olds, and I think this is something that EER even wrote about, have wanted to leave the country. And if an Islamist ideology or a government in a country in this region is run by an Islamist government or by an Islamist party, if that leads to a brain drain and leads to a lot of younger people wanting to leave that country, then I think that is definitely not where the region wants to see itself going. It's something that we can't allow happening. And they've proved to these youth that they are bad at governance. They're excellent. They've always been amazing being in opposition, but they can't run a country, and I think they proved that quite well. I'll leave it there so I can give the opportunity for, well, so I think I've run way past my time, but yeah, that's all from me at this stage. I did skip, I think, the foreign funding aspect, the recent accusations against Ennahda regarding foreign funding that they received during their campaigning. But I'll leave the rest for Hussein and Dr. Khadija. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohammed. I'm sure we'll come back to it in the Q&A later on.
Sure.
Are you able to take your, that's excellent. If we can hand over to Khadija for 10-15 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks, Mohammed, for this excellent overview. So I will try, while reviewing my notes, to just not repeat some of what you already said and just focus on other things. So obviously, really, for me, titles such as Decline of Ennahda or even all the Muslim Brotherhood, I wouldn't completely agree with that because, and I will speak essentially from the perspective of Tunisia, but also since Ennahda belongs to an international movement, an international organization of the Muslim Brotherhood, they are so very much interlinked that it's very important to see it from that perspective. For me, really, we have to have the right diagnosis in terms of really of this movement. And I don't want to go up to 1928 when they appeared, not even to the 13th century, because it's since Ibn Taymiyyah, and we can review the whole movement and whatever names they are always taking in every place, but it has to be put on that perspective, because in Tunisia, the issue is that some people, some even elite, seems to think about the Ennahda or the Muslim Brotherhood or the whole political Islam as if it appears the last 10 years, while it's not true. And it's very, very important for Tunisian and for anybody to understand that these people have been infiltrating the Tunisian society since the late 70s, early 80s. So they've been there for quite some time. And why it's so crucial to understand that, it is also to understand that it's not just by more or less trying to stop Ennahda or by stopping the parliament or whatever that we can speak whether about their decline or think that we can get rid of them that easily. It's not the case. And why speaking about this infiltration, and sometimes I'm giving the metaphor of they're like a cancer, that they really invade a body, and it's not that easy by cutting one organ that we can think we can get rid of that cancer. It's much more profound. And it's true that they tried really to change the Tunisian culture, Tunisian country from a secular country, despite our article in the constitution that says that we are a Muslim country. But unlike the other constitutions of the region, we don't have an article that says that our legislation is based on Islam or Islamic Sharia, which makes a huge difference. So they tried to move our society from that secular culture and mindset to a more religious one, and trying also to mix religion with all state powers. And sometimes they did succeed. They did succeed with the judiciary, somehow with the legislative power, not necessarily with the executive power, even though there were alliances, the one cited by Mohammed with Meshishi, but even before Meshishi, even the alliance with Beja Qaid Sibsi, all of that has been there. So obviously the whole Muslim Brotherhood system, whether in most countries, but essentially if we speak about Egypt or Tunisia, they're trying to take advantage of all social and political crises to take over where government have been unable to meet the needs of the citizens. And this was the case in Tunisia for the last 10 years. After the uprising, obviously the several governments have been unable to do anything. So they were trying really to move from the economic recession, from the poor education system, the unemployment and everything. and they've been always trying to present themselves as the only alternative, which they are not, of course. So this welfare, let's say, type of strategy and ideological narrative, they used it really to have potential recruit and so on. And even during the conversations around the 2014 constitution, the new one, Tunisian one, they even have tried to mess up with women's rights in Tunisia, but they didn't succeed, because really we had those rights for the last more than 60 years. And of course, women, Tunisian women, opposed very fiercely that anybody touches to their rights. So it seems that it took the Tunisian people a decade to realize finally that not only this party, I mean, has nothing to do with the value and principle of Islam, and to discover really their true face, the true fact that they are mercenary, really that are currently accused of political assassination. Our martyr Shukri Bel'eid, Mohamed Brahmi, but many others. They're also being accused currently of corruption, money laundering, and really direct links with extremist groups. We know what role they played in sending our youth to be part of ISIL, Daesh in Syria, in Iraq, and elsewhere. And also their relationship with the all the intelligence with foreign parties, and really aiming at harming our national interest. So as I said, they've been very powerful in infiltrating the judiciary. And this is why the big battle now that the President Qais Said is having with the High Judicial Council on one hand. So yes, it is true that they are now, Ennahda is facing a deep crisis. On one hand, within their own internal structure and in their internal fight and support system and everything, but also there is an open criticism, a distrust that we see that is on the rise. And here, when it comes really to the relationship you spoke, Mohammed, about Turkey, I think that I'm still questioning the fact that Turkey is still hosting some influential media. Of course, some of the Muslim Brotherhood media left to the UK, but they are still there. And of course, when we saw the last appearance, when Erdogan, I don't know where he was a few days ago, he's still, of course, using the Rab'a sign, which is the Muslim Brotherhood sign. So somehow I would question a little bit what is happening on that front. So now, in addition to, of course, all the security and financial prosecution, the risk for Ennahda is that now the investigation will open so many other cases, because it's not only about the cases they have. They have really to answer for all the shortcomings in preventing and punishing many activities. They've been in power. I mean, they've been at the prime minister level twice. They've been at they occupied many ministerial positions, even though they are claiming that they never have been in power, they never run the country. But of course, Tunisian people know exactly who was there, like Al-Arayed, the Jbeli, all those prime minister, and all of that. They've benefited also a lot of foreign financing of their electoral campaign. They are being accused of that. And here we have always to ask really the question, who is funding them? Why are they still being funded, and by who, and how to stop that funding? This one point that we might come back later to that, because it's really important. I wouldn't say that the settlement of accounts is easy now, because really now because they are still there, they are trying to hide the evidence, to destroy some evidence. Some of them are fleeing the country, and really we don't understand why they haven't been all prosecuted as of yet. So it is very, very important. Some political parties are really calling for classifying Ennahda as a terrorist organization. They still didn't succeed. But if they would, then maybe measures to freeze their funds and hold them accountable would be very good, very important. Currently, and I will conclude by these few points, currently Tunisia is in a very difficult economic situation. Tunisia might face a national bankruptcy because of all this bad governance for the last 10 years, thanks to Ennahda and all the accomplices of Ennahda who are responsible for that. Our debt is now represent nearly 100% of our GDP. So, and as a result also of the widespread of unemployment, we have more than 51% of our young people aged 18 to 29. They are really thinking about migrating to Europe or elsewhere. Currently, and under the pressure of the International Monetary Fund, the President Said put a political roadmap that will go, he just put it in December 2021. But the issue is that the new parliament and the new election will not happen before end of this year, which might be quite long in my sense. So also Ennahda now, some of its leaders are trying, like Al-Makki, to create a new political party. So we will see how it's going to be received by Tunisian people, but I don't think that they can really fool us with these new parties or being whatever thing. So yes, Ennahda is living, I would say, a moment of existential uncertainty. But the real question is whether they have anything to offer Tunisian or not. We will see. I don't think so. What we are missing, and I hope that we will have a chance to discuss those points, is that how to really now, from now on, to have a true South-South cooperation, solidarity, but also North-South cooperation to be able to face this common enemy together, how to stop their funding, definitely, and also how to make sure that people in Europe, essentially, some even MPs, member of parliament, who are still showing solidarity with Rashid al-Ghanouchi as the president of the parliament, how to explain to them really what is it about and how to stop doing it, because it doesn't serve us, it doesn't serve them at the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Hussein, over to you for 10,
All right.
15 minutes.
Well, thank you. Excuse me. Thank you so much. And it's great to be here. And I appreciate the remarks of my colleagues. So I'm not going to talk about this issue from a Tunisian point of view, because I can't do that. But what I can do is give my take on the overview of essentially a decade that in Arab political culture, regionally, is sort of the story, among other things, of the rise and fall of the Brotherhood. I mean, that's really what we've watched, right, in the past 10, 12 years. And, you know, let's look for a second at how that happened. Right? The Muslim Brotherhood, generally, obviously each country is different and each party is different, but generally speaking, had a set of remarkable strengths going into the Arab Spring uprisings that unseated long-standing rulers and dictators and systems, well, not really systems, so that's crucial, but long-standing leaders in a series of Arab republics, right? They had huge competitive advantages in the immediate aftermath. First of all, they had no taint with the former regime. They, generally speaking, had been for decades and even almost a century in opposition. So they were not tainted with the former regime. They had existing, and uniquely had existing organizations on the ground. They had, party structures. They had cadres. They had an organization to go into electioneering and other politicking post uprising that really no one else outside of the taint of the old regimes had at all. The difference, the exception was the state structures that continued to exist, but I'll come back to that. They had momentum, and because though they were not central to the origins or early stages of any of the rebellions, pretty much, they managed to glom onto them and claim the flag of revolution, the rhetoric of revolution. Al Jazeera was very effective in the early stages in combining, the Brotherhood's identity regionally with the concept of revolution and freedom and democracy. And I was got mashed up in a way that was quite effective early on in that decade. So they were able to use the uprisings and the momentum of the uprisings, and all of those unique one-time competitive advantages put Brotherhood parties in very strong positions to have excellent or at least good outcomes. And all of the outcomes were either good to excellent in the first elections after the rebellions. All right, so they come into that early period with very strong advantages and a real shot at getting a chance at governance, which my colleagues have been talking about, which they generally did have. The other thing worth mentioning is that the fact that they were not violent terrorist Salafist jihadist groups like Al-Qaeda or Daesh or something like that worked for their advantage for a time in a very interesting way. And I'm going to come back to that relationship because it hasn't proven to be an advantage at all over time. But initially, there was a whole narrative about how that was a good thing, that they were Islamists, but they were not Al-Qaeda style Islamists. That somehow that was a selling point for a while. The weaknesses, though, became very apparent immediately during the elections, not even after the elections. And that was, first of all, the illusion inside in the West, in much of the West, especially Western academia, in parts of the Arab world on all sides, and especially among the Islamists themselves, the brothers themselves, that they were a majority, that because most of the Arab citizens are Muslims and fairly devout Muslims, that therefore they are Islamists. And if you just give them exposure to Al-Banna style Islamism, that they're going to vote for Brotherhood parties, and they're easily won over. And that's what they really want. This was an illusion, and it was a very bad illusion. And I think the brothers really believed it. They told themselves that for 70, 80, 90 years, and they actually drank, in the United States, we'd say drank their own Kool-Aid on that one. And that set them up for real problems because, first of all, that was definitely not the case. And when people got a look at their governing agenda, such as it was, and they didn't care for it. And the bigger problem, of course, is that Islam is not a political program. It's as simple as that. They told themselves that for a decade, that Islam huwa al-hal, that it's the answer. But Islam doesn't tell you anything about tax policy. It doesn't tell you anything about climate change. It's not a political program. You can say it is all you like, but it isn't one, right? And when you get into government, and that's what you have, and the cupboard gets open, you discover it's bare. What is it? It's a set mainly of reactionary social attitudes. It's a set of attitudes about gender, about sexuality, about morals, about conduct, about society. The governance aspect of it is incredibly thin, and that becomes very clear to people right away. So what you end up with then is a party structure seeking power, right, without a governance agenda, and that's very and with a social agenda that most people don't want, right? So this is a formula for defeat. And the problem especially is when you don't realize it yourself. And I think this is what happened, generally speaking, across the board. And what we saw in places like Egypt, and less dramatically in Tunisia, but dramatically enough to create the collapse of Ennahda at the moment in Tunisia and elsewhere, is overreach, right? Extreme overreach. When power was at hand, there was this assumption, first of all, that that not only they were the majority, but they adopted, and especially the brothers in Egypt really were very clear. I debated many of them on Arab TV stations during 2011, 2012, 2013. They were very clear that they believed that 50% plus one, or the majority votes, even if it's a 42%, that entitles you to do anything you want. But this is not democracy at all. But they adopted a radical majoritarian theory, misunderstanding of democracy that they insisted entitled them to shred everybody's rights, minority rights, individual rights, women's rights, doesn't matter, because we got more votes than anybody else in a parliamentary election. And this is toxic. And they didn't seem to realize that. The drive to stack the bureaucracy, to stack the courts, as Khadija was just mentioning, really frightened both majorities and the existing state structures. It's really important to note that in countries like Egypt and Tunisia, the state did not fall. The leadership fell, but the army was there, the bureaucracy was there, the state did not collapse. So this is very different. When you see a state collapse, maybe in Libya there is no state, but generally speaking, the state structures in these Arab republics did not collapse because of the rebellions, and the state structures were able to defend themselves, and rule of law and the old constitutions, or at least the way they perceived that. And this was a reality that all these Islamist governments came up against in a very serious way, and because they acted as if it had collapsed, and it had not collapsed. Now, even deeper, there are three huge problems baked in to the Muslim Brotherhood, the traditional Muslim Brotherhood approach, which turns people off and led to failure. The first is that it's revolutionary, which alienates maybe not the revolutionaries on the street, but alienates other governments, especially in the Gulf and places like that. Other governments do not like revolutionary movements. Secondly, and this alienates everybody, conspiratorial. They operate in secret. They operate like criminal gangs. You don't know how much money they have. You don't know where their membership are. They do everything underground. So that's operating like a criminal organization. And obviously it sends the message that you're hiding because you have something to hide. It's not great. It's a very bad message. The third thing is, and this is the killer in the Arab world, that they have been transnational. All right. Transnationalism is a fatal flaw for the traditional Muslim Brotherhood, that they saw themselves and acted and talked as if they were part of a regional movement, which they were. Well, this is very bad, because you might wave the Quran around and claim to be the biggest Muslim and have a mark on your forehead and whatever it is, but there's another symbol that's at least as important in all these countries, which is the flag. And if you can't even touch the flag because you're perceived as part of a broader transnational movement that puts other concerns, regional concerns, ideological concerns, pan-Islamic concerns above the flag, you will be perceived at best as insufficiently patriotic, and at worst as disloyal, or worse than that, by most people who are patriotic. They want to know, what are you going to do for Egypt? What are you going to do for Tunisia? Don't tell me about, Islam in Morocco or in Yemen or something. Yeah, my country, our country. This is very important. They lost that. They lost it. They got clobbered in Tunisia, in Libya, very early on because of that disloyalty, and it drove them into, it was a major factor in driving them into defeat, I would argue, in both Tunisia and in Egypt and elsewhere. So this is very important. Then come back to the jihadists, right? That ideological closeness to the Salafist jihadists, violent, extreme violent groups, which initially I think was a kind of advantage in certain ways, became a very big disadvantage. Because, where these uprisings became militarized, like in Libya and Syria, they were not radical enough. And the Salafist jihadists took over from the brothers. But in other places, they were too close to, their rhetoric, their ideas were basically they essentially gave rise to the ideas of the Salafist jihadists, and they shared too many common goals. So they became poisoned. So either they were not enough like the jihadists, or they were too much like the jihadists, but you've really then narrowed your base. The appeal becomes very, very limited. And I think in the end, what I think happened to the brothers on this score is that effectively, here I'm going to give a thumbnail. We can go into it more in the discussion, but basically there were two theories in the Arab world about Islamism and terrorism. One was the Qatari version, which is the Brotherhood is the corrective. It gives the Islamists a place to go so they can be political without blowing everything up and shooting everyone. The UAE had the opposite theory, championed the extreme version of the opposite theory, which is no, the Brotherhood is the source, it's the gateway drug. It's the kernel of the cancer. It introduces all these ideas, And whether the fact that a lot of brothers don't pick up a gun doesn't matter. That this is the heart of the problem. And I think the UAE's opinion has won out in contemporary Arab political culture. So this is very important. Now, there were two phases of the pushback against the Brotherhood regionally, right? The first phase, which is from the end of 2010 through 2013, early 2014, was the fear of a green wave, the fear in say the Gulf Arab countries and among many majorities that there would be a wave of governments taking over from former leaders and dictators in Arab republics that were being roiled by these uprisings. And that effectively failed, and the turning point was obviously the ouster of Mohamed Morsi after his extreme overreach and much bigger protests against him than there had been against al-Mubarak. So at that point, I think the concern shifted to the idea that Turkey and Qatar were trying to create a regional network of groups that were not necessarily going to be in government, but that were going to be powerful and interconnected and sort of a Sunni Islamist analog in a way to Iran's network of Shia Islamist groups. This really didn't happen. Whether it was because Turkey and Qatar didn't try hard enough, or because they didn't really want to do it, or because it simply couldn't be done, for whatever reason, the project did not emerge. And what you ended up with instead is this reality where all the powers in the region that project power are exhausted. They're overextended, all of them. After a decade of confrontation and conflict, they all bit off more than they can chew. And there's de-escalation everywhere because they've all gone too far. And the most powerful of the Middle Eastern countries, which is Turkey, at least on paper, is also the most overextended. I mean, who didn't they quarrel with? What? Azerbaijan, Northern Cyprus, Qatar, Hamas. I mean, it's a very small list of marginal players. So they really needed to pull back at this point. And you've got all the major powers in the region entered into what I've been calling for a year and a half now, an era of consolidation, retrenchment, and maneuver. By consolidation, I mean they're trying to keep hold of what they got during 10 years of confrontation and conflict that they need to keep, and that's cost effective. You know, retrenchment, they want to rebuild their strength, military, economic, what have you, and that's what they're doing, right? They're focusing inward. Maneuver means using diplomacy, politics, and commerce rather than fighting and proxy wars. Now, there are local actors like the Houthis in Yemen and al-Assad in Syria who are perfectly determined to keep fighting. See no reason. They see lots of advantages to keep fighting. And so whether or not this de-escalation can really sustain itself is a big question. Iran's commitment to it is very questionable. So we'll see what happens. But the point is that what it means is that Turkey's enthusiasm for continuing to be the patron of this failed, non-existent regional network that never materialized has sort of vanished. And there isn't much left to work with. So while Qatari media may still be promoting all kinds of demagoguery, including Brotherhood rhetoric and pan-Arab nationalist rhetoric, sort of quasi-Nasserite, quasi-Ba'athist stuff, which they do, it doesn't really matter. Because there's nothing, it's just going into the air. And I think it's very important to understand that one of the important outcomes of the boycott of Qatar was the defanging of Al Jazeera and a lot of Qatari media that went into the boycott with a lot of street cred in the Arab world, with a lot of credibility about nationalism and Islamic this and Arab that. And in the course of the boycott was recast, especially in the Gulf, but even in other parts of the Arab world, as Qatari propaganda, as the mouthpiece of Doha. And its ability to move people is greatly reduced. I mean, to the point of it being just another station, which it wasn't. I mean, it built up a lot of cachet in the 90s and during the Arab Spring even, and that's largely gone. And that's very, very important for understanding the crisis of the Brotherhood, in my opinion. So there's very little for them to work with and very little for Turkey and Qatar to work with. So it doesn't even matter whether the Qataris remain committed to this or not. The collapse of the regional threat has facilitated the rapprochement in the Gulf, and it just, people are not that worried about it anymore because it's sort of empty rhetoric at this point, frankly. At least that's how it's perceived. So where's the Brotherhood regionally now? Okay, holding on in Gaza, yes. Hamas, wonderful. Is that a prize? I'm not sure. It sounds to me more like a problem than a prize, and still influential in Yemen, parts of Yemen, al-Islah, but it's in decline, right? I mean, the whole Houthi defeat in the areas surrounding Maghreb was based on kicking the Islah governor out. And even in the Hadi camp, where they've been very important, they're in decline. Ditto in Western Libya, right? Ditto in the old GNA areas in Tripoli and Misrata, they're in decline. So they're still there, but it's not going well for them, even where they are. The big redoubt, you know, are the people hiding in Qatar and Turkey, and a few other places like that, and Gaza, which again I don't think is like a jewel in the crown for anybody, frankly. So the final point I want to make is, look, can they come back? Yeah, of course they can, and here are the factors. Number one, their best asset right now is overreach, which you could see in terms of this every 30, 60 days, the constitution keeps getting suspended in Tunisia. I mean, this is not sustainable. At a certain point, you have to have some rule of law, and it's an overreach, and it can be okay for a little while, but it's very alarming. This is not a way you can run a country. So number two, you have endemic failures, that maybe there are problems that no one can solve. Unemployment was mentioned, Khadija mentioned, I believe. Unemployment, there's no answer for this in, say, in Sisi's Egypt. There's no solution. And in the end, this can really undermine the anti-Islamist governments and give an opportunity to come back. The grievances of the Arab Spring about transparency, accountability, and rule of law have not been answered, I mean, pretty much anywhere. And they may come back. I think they're likely to come back. So at that point, obviously, it opens up any kind of oppositional group, including potentially an Islamist one, a Muslim Brotherhood offshoot of some kind. But if they do come back in that context, they better have something more substantial than Islam huwa al-hal, than the idea that Islam is the solution. And the myth that they have a governance agenda, because it has been tested and demonstrated they never did. And if they don't develop one, it's just going to be, again, the politics of the hijab posted on top of a national set of problems that require governance answers, and it won't work. And the final thing I would say is they should be very concerned and interested in the decoupling of Islam in general and Wahhabism in particular from the Saudi state legitimation narrative in Saudi Arabia right now. It's another indication. Of course, Saudi Arabia is not Islamist and nothing to do with the Brotherhood, etc. But it's another example of the way in which Arab political culture is moving beyond religious legitimation and looking to nationalism, populism, and my country first kind of thing more than ever. It's a fad internationally. It's a thing everywhere, but it's very much a thing in Saudi Arabia in a very dramatic way. This week, Tuesday was Founders Day. It cuts out the Wahhabi and even the clerical Islamic role in the Saudi state legitimation narrative almost entirely. And brothers may say to themselves, well, what does that have to do with us? And my answer would be a heck of a lot, actually, a really whole heck of a lot. Think about it. All right.
Thank you very much. I think to take just the first question to slightly broaden the picture out a bit, or maybe to cover the other side of it. Do we think the Brotherhood's decline in the region, its rejection at a kind of popular and state level, will impact its influence in the West among Muslim populations, or are those two things running on two separate tracks? So if we go the same order to Mohamed Hineidi and then Hussein.
Very much for the question. Thanks, Hussein and Khadija, for the wonderful discussion. I think I learned a lot from both of you. Carl, with respect to your question, I think that the way that people view London as being the third HQ of the MB or of Islamists after Ankara and Doha, I think is a major problem. And I don't particularly think that that the West, I don't particularly think that Islamists living in the West will become weaker as a result of the relative decline in the Middle East and North Africa. I think it actually might be the opposite. I think we might see, a lot of people sort of flee, not so much flee, but not really seeking refuge either, but we're going to have a transfer of power or of leadership from certain individuals that have resided in the region, Islamist individuals, leaders, that will now be sort of, that will quiet and, you know, they will lay low, and they will have their counterparts in certain parts of the US, definitely the UK, not so much France. I think France is mainly like a Salafi, Wahhabi sort of arena. Other parts of Europe, though, for sure. And I think these people will vow or will try and lobby for certain Islamist parties in the region. In a way, it's not lobbying directly for them, but more criticizing the government and the leaderships that have been accused of repressing and suppressing Islamists across the region, which includes Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, which includes Qais Said, the Gulf nations, except for Qatar. Yeah, I think Qatar at this stage as well has nothing to lean on. It doesn't have anything anymore. As Hussein mentioned, you know, Al Jazeera, it's basically lost its fangs. No one really trusts it anymore. It doesn't have any particular leader that it can really support. So I think we might be seeing a lot of support from certain MPs in Western countries and in the US, or certain European countries and the US, for leaders, certain causes, certain charities. A lot of criticism towards you know, human rights violations by different countries across the region that ousted Islamist-led governments. So yeah, this is my 2 cents about what I think could happen, but looking forward to hearing what Khadija and Hussein have to say.
Thank you. Over to Khadija.
Yeah, thanks. So to add on what Mohamed just said, I think that what still puzzles me a lot is the position of a certain member of parliament of the European Parliament or some US senators. The solidarity they're showing to the Muslim Brotherhood is quite frightening, and what we need to think about is how to reach out to them with the right message, or how to convince them, or whatever. Now, when it comes to our diaspora in Europe or elsewhere, the problem is that the diaspora is not the same way, it's not following the same evolution or natural evolution of culture. The same way, they wouldn't necessarily have very quickly the same position as, let's say, the Tunisian in our the Tunisian or the Egyptian or whatever. So another work needs to be done towards them. And this is also, we see it also, the fact that there isn't a counter movement. Let's say, let's talk about the hijab, the veil and all of that. Somebody would have thought, if there is a true decline of all the Muslim Brotherhood or political Islam or just you name it, we would have seen really a counter movement of women just understanding finally that it has nothing to do with Islam, it was a lie and everything. I'm not saying it started, but it's still a very shy movement towards this. And the last thing is also the newly converted Muslim, especially women from Western country who are married to this type of Muslim Brotherhood people, and who are really, they scare me because they become completely, we see the brainwash they've been subjected to, and also how to reach out to them, how to speak, I'm not quite sure. But over to you, Dr. Hussein.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think that's all largely correct. Look, here's the thing. The Brotherhood is not understood in the West at all. I mean, maybe in parts of Europe it's understood. In the United States, I can assure you, people have no idea. On the right, they think it's just Al-Qaeda and that's it, and Daesh, and it's all the same thing. They just have no idea what it is and what it means. On the left, they tend to not understand what the problems with this is, that they just think this is Islam, this is Muslims, and why are you being mean to Muslims, and they're not getting it. So the problem is that being organized for the same reasons that they entered into the instability moment at the end of 2010 and after that, during the uprisings, in a position of strength that was the same set of advantages that allowed them to form the organizations that became the sort of national Muslim voices in the United States, for sure, in many, not all of them, but some of the bigger ones. I think in Britain as well. And I agree, France is a different story, but still, and then you have a different kind of Islamist. So I think as long as the culture of the Western Muslims is derivative from that in the Muslim world, in the Arab world and the rest of the Muslim world, this is going to be a problem, because what it means is that a lot of it comes from dissidents, a lot of it comes from activists with a politicized religious agenda who flee to the West in order not to go to prison, or in order to do and say, things that would not be tolerated, including even by reasonable governments in their home countries. They end up, and they are therefore in a position to be very organized and to say that they represent the Muslims of Europe or the United States or Australia or whatever it is, but pursue that agenda that they brought with them. Now, in the long run, I think they're going to have a very big problem, which is that, in fact, the Western Muslims, especially in the United States, are going to develop their own kind of Islam. They're going to develop an American Islam. It's going to be inevitable. It's going to be generational. And eventually, you're going to see, in my opinion, the opposite flow, that where you're going to see actually American versions of Islam influencing Islam in the traditionally Muslim majority states. This is not happening yet, but it will happen. So I think it's a period of time where these activists have really strong advantages, though there are lots of people who don't agree with them. And who are organized, but in the long run, I think they're pretty doomed for the generational reason I mentioned. Thank you.
So this question, I think, can bear on Tunisia, but you can take it outside regionally if you prefer. But Hussein, to pick up on a point you made about the split between the Qataris and the other Gulf states, which basically the Qataris thought if you give them this much Islamism, they won't go the full way to jihadi Salafism.
That was their argument.
Yeah, and the other side said if you give them this, it gateways to the rest of it.
Yeah.
In Tunisia now, how do you think that dynamic will play out? I mean, because obviously the Al Qaeda and the Islamic State, they basically have said to the Brotherhood, "We told you so." Like they wouldn't allow Islam to conquer the states by elections. We told you violence was the only thing that could get to power. And I'm assuming that some number of people are going to believe that. But do you think it will be a small enough number that essentially it just keeps being marginalized further and further? Or will enough people listen to that message that Tunisia could have a fairly serious security problem, and by extension in the region there could be further security problems? In other words, you have a polarization where the kind of the peaceful Islamists get eclipsed and you just have a larger jihadist movement. Sorry, that's a rambling question, but I hope it was in some sense intelligible. If we go to Mohammed first.
All right, just feel myself on mute. Thanks, Kyle. Look, I think what EMAN, as a founding director of EMAN and as someone who focuses on extremism and with a background in geopolitics as well, when it comes to Islamist extremism, I think that the point that Hussein was making, and the point that the UAE and other regional countries that they've been making for a while stands true, and I think it's been proven that the NB or Islam or political Islam's conveyor belt, right? If you start the conveyor belt, that would lead you to jihadism, it will lead you to Daesh, it will lead you to Al Qaeda, to Taliban, it will lead you to the extreme militant terrorism, all right, extreme Islamist militant terrorism, which is all the non-state actors that we've seen from Daesh to Taliban to Al Qaeda, etc. I don't think that the MB or Islamism or the Muslim Brotherhood is a firewall, right? So like, oh, if you join us, we will ensure that no one joins terrorist groups. I don't think that's the case at all. I think based on a lot of quantitative and qualitative data, it is definitely true that the road to Islamism will eventually is a highway to radical, militant, sort of Islamist tendencies. I think with Tunisia, I think it was very important that for a country that was very largely secular and very liberal, we saw 3,000, which was 3,000 Tunisians that fought for Daesh in Mosul and Raqqa in Syria and Iraq. I think that was in 2015, and that was a very sort of concerning problem because you know, it was the highest. It was the country with the highest number. It was the Arab country with the highest number of foreign fighters, and it only has a population of 10 million or 11 million, and it's always been quite a secular and liberal country. So I think at this stage, Carl, I'm not sure if you know, there's a few components to your question, so I'm trying to answer them by deconstructing them, you know, in different stages. I think the peaceful Islamists now, will they be eclipsed? Will they be eclipsed in Tunisia? I think that there are strong Islamist currents still in the country. As Khadija mentioned, they're trying to form other political parties in the future as well. As we know, the MB doesn't just evaporate, doesn't just disappear. It's called Ennahda today. It was called Ennahda from 2011 to 2022, right, or 2021, 10 years. It could be called something completely different in a few years' time when we've seen Ennahda 2.0, whatever it's called. And I think at this stage, we're going to see different, you know, we're going to see potentially more radical elements eclipse the peaceful elements. Peaceful elements could be the ones that immigrate to the West, and from there, their own networks, while the radical ones stay in the country and potentially put up a fight. Over to you, Khadija and Hussein.
Okay, thanks. And I think because Ennahda had a chance to be really kind of running the country in and out during the last decade, I don't think that they stand a chance anymore to continue really doing whatever or to go to that extreme. Of course, obviously, first of all, for one reason, it's what Dr. Hussein mentioned, the loyalty to the flag. This is very, very important. We all remember this beautiful young lady who went on the roof of her university because another student put up the Daesh flag and she went up to take it out. This is one hand. But let's also remember that the young people who want to join Daesh that Mohammed was speaking about, many of them were born in Europe and raised in Europe. And despite that, they flew thinking that they are serving Islam by joining terrorist group and killing our brothers and sisters in Syria and Iraq and everywhere. So I think that I still believe personally, like Jefferson, that vigilance is the price of freedom, and that in Tunisia, we will have to really stay very, very vigilant of not thinking that they disappear, they wouldn't, but just to continue the fight. Over to you, Dr. Hussein.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all of that. I think look, the Brotherhood parties are parties and political organizations, right? So that they're not pacifists. They are, you know, willing to engage in violence sometimes. They've certainly got a track record of assassinations and bombings and things. But their main aim is a political appeal to a majority or enough of the population to give them power in government, right? And the system is sort of incidental. The agenda of the more radical groups, the Salafist jihadist groups, so-called Qaeda and Daesh and what, is much more expansive. I mean, it even does away with the states that exist and everything. So it's you know, for them, I think they're so divorced from the political realities in which, you know, Arab political power is contested, that they can exist in fringes. They can exist and continue on with some guns in some small place somewhere. You know, they can persist online. That is enough for an extremist group to not die. A movement like the Brotherhood parties you know, whether it's unreformed one or one that's trying to recast itself, you know, as much as the Jordanian and Moroccan brothers have done, or as Ennahda did in a different way, or those who refuse to change a budge an inch, like most of the Egyptian brothers, it doesn't really matter. They're still all trying to operate within the actually existing political contests in Arab countries, especially in the republics. And that has become almost impossible. So I think the momentum shifts to the violent people because they can persist, you know, just in a very, I mean, they're gangsters. So they don't need to be popular at all. They don't need to convince more than 25% or 30 or 40% of the public that they're at least okay. They will shoot you if you don't like them and you say so. They won't try to convince you. They will just kill you, and that's a lot easier. But you know, in the end, it's not a more successful bid for power. It's a less successful bid for power. It's more destructive. But it's probably where the momentum among the Islamists now goes, unfortunately.
Thank you.
I'd just like to, Carl, sorry, just like to add one more thing onto there. I think that the biggest problem with the West at large is that democracy is the most beautiful and perfect thing that could ever happen to any country. And since the Muslim Brotherhood has sort of exploited and manipulated that term, and they want to implement it across the Middle East, the West looks at them, or has looked at them, as being a benevolent actor that wants what's best for the entire region, right? And I think that's the biggest problem, is that once we exploit democracy, which is a beautiful thing, by a malevolent actor or malevolent actors, then we need to sort of reflect and say, well, that's definitely not going to be what we or who we want to support, which is Islamists or the Muslim Brotherhood. And I think they've been able to sort of manipulate a lot of Western countries and European countries, particularly when it comes to that.
I think that there's a manipulation on the far left and parts of the far right in these countries, and among some academics and intellectuals, yes, who have not got it. But I think there's an exaggerated sense, for example, of how sympathetic the first Barack Obama term, the presidency, US presidency, the administration that was in power in 2010, 2011, 2012, was towards the Brotherhood. I don't think, I mean, there's a narrative that they were sympathetic. They were not sympathetic. There may have been a few people in the administration who were sympathetic, but Obama himself, Hillary Clinton, they were not fans of the Brotherhood. They were willing to put up with them if they won elections, and Hillary Clinton laid out some terms that I think were fairly reasonable, and they had more hope in them than they should have had. I think they were more optimistic that they would behave themselves in a reasonable constitutional way, and that they would accept the rule of law in a way they didn't. So they were naive, but they were not really, in my view, fans. I'm not going to speak about any European states or whatever, but I was here in Washington up to my neck in this at that time, and they were not. If they could have pushed a button, they would not have put Muslim Brotherhood governments in power. They could not push a button. So what they said was, if this happens, we'll live with it. I mean, that was not the answer a lot of people in the Middle East wanted to hear, but it's different from saying that they actually liked the Brotherhood. That those are two different things in my view.
Thank you. I think basically if we give you all a couple of minutes to wrap up and draw together any thoughts that you had overall. If we go around the same.
I have a question.
Oh, sorry.
No worries, no worries. I have a question for all the speakers. So earlier, Prof. Hussein was saying if they want to make a comeback, the Islamists, or at least if they want to get out from this current crisis, they had better offer something more than al-Islam or al-Hal, so Islam is the solution. Do you think that they might try at least to secularize their rhetoric, their narrative, and also their action, as some groups that are considered to be near the Brotherhood are doing already in the West right now? Do you think this can be possible to frame, that they will try to frame their discourse in more secular ways in order to not only to appeal to a bigger audience, because we saw that they don't really need it or not necessarily need it, but to be less vulnerable to criticism and setback and judgments, both in the East and the West?
I have some thoughts on this. I think it's an excellent question. I think it's the question that these groups have to ask themselves. Can they do this? Can they do it successfully? And these are open questions. There's a certain effort to do it in monarchies, right? By embracing the flag and the system and the king. You see this in Morocco, right? And you see this in Jordan with not the Palestinian brothers, but the Jordanian brothers, who have kind of like subordinated themselves to the monarchical constitutional system and pretend, or at least try, or agreed to operate within that framework because it gives them the best chance of getting what they can get, and other paths are blocked. And there was obviously an effort by Ennahda to recast itself as no longer transnational, right? No longer conspiratorial and no longer revolutionary in Tunisia. It didn't really work because the senior leadership of the organization evidently was not sincere in this. I mean, that was quite clear. Though I do think there was a faction that was very sincere about becoming, Muslim Democrats, like not secular, but rule of law, constitutional, conservative, religious people. I think there is a faction in Ennahda that said that and meant it. I don't think it was the dominant faction. I don't think it was the national leadership. But I've met them, and some of them convinced me that they're sincere. But just having a faction that is sincere does not mean the party has changed its basic attitudes. And I think that's the problem. So that in both these cases, it's not really sufficient to give a framework. So you have a little piecemeal version here and a little piecemeal version there, and none of them have really worked. At the same time, the entire movement, right, from Daesh on one extreme to the most moderate, sort of brotherhood offshoot Islamists anywhere, are discredited. The whole concept of refracting Arab governance through an Islamic lens, an Islamist lens, has been discredited because it's meaningless. It's meaningless. Islam is a religion. It is not a political ideology. Islam is not a political program. Hadith and the Quran do not tell you anything about government policies. This is a fact. And when you're in opposition and you don't have any power, it's not a problem to fudge that fact. But when you get close to power, you get immediately confronted with that fact. And until there's some way around that fact, I think it's going to be a big problem for any of these efforts, coupled with the fact that the current generation, for the most part, is not sincere in these changes. Some are, but not enough of them in my view. So that's my answer.
If we go to Mohamed, if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think to secularize would then take away from their core sort of support base of devout Muslims who want Islam to be political, who want to basically shove their version of Islam, or just Islam generally, down the throats of the entire population. I don't drink, therefore no one should drink. There should be no bars in the country, or all shops should close during prayer time, or whatever it is. If they do secularize and they become, then the question, and then they also have solutions on climate change. They have solutions on gender equality. They've got, they have solutions on absolutely everything. First, they have to prove themselves as people who can run a country and work the economy. But also, how do they portray Islam? And as Hussein said, it's a religion. It's a faith, right? It's just the last faith in the three Abrahamic faiths in the two Abrahamic faiths that preceded Islam. What do they do? And in my mind, I think a lot of that would come down to education. There's no teaching of, people think caliphate or caliphates, and the golden age of Islam was caliphate. So therefore, we just have to be united under transnational banner of faith, rather than 22 or 23 different countries that have flags, and that's it. All the solutions, that will be the solution. no, it's about education. What did it look like? You know, why was there a caliphate back then? The people that a lot of devout Muslims, I think, do not really understand Islam, and a lot of the achievements that came out of the Muslim world 1,000 years ago are not really quite understood. You know, I can guarantee you, if you ask the average Islamist who the top 10 Muslim scientists that were involved in groundbreaking research in astronomy and alchemy and chemistry, mathematics and physics, they couldn't be able to name you 10, but they'd say that, you know, that, yeah, women shouldn't work or whatever it is. So I think a lot of that would come down to education. I think education and economy, the two E's, are the most important things when it comes to that for any potential Islamist group to become sort of less Islamist. It's not really about Islam. It's just about being a political party, and you know, Islam is part of many Arabs' culture. It's part of. I have a lot of Christian friends that are Muslims, and they say Alhamdulillah, Inshallah, and Salah. They say Muslim words. They live in an environment, in an Arab culture that is heavily influenced by a religion, but it's not, you know, it's not an extreme form of religion. It's just, you know, it's just a normal faith that has its sort of colors within the culture itself. That wasn't a very sort of academic answer, but I just wanted to sort of, you know, highlight the importance of education and sort of economic, sort of building up the economy as the two most important factors of any future sort of group. But I would also be very careful as to encourage any sort of Islamist groups from returning with the same sort of mentality, with the same sort of ideologies that they've based themselves upon since 1928 and up until today.
Thank you. Khadija, have you had any thoughts?
Yeah, so thanks, Sarah, for the great question. I think that really Ennahda tried at one point, few years down the road, to go to this, well, to look like secularists or whatever. I remember at that time I published even an article where I was asking them 15 clear questions to which extent they're really serious about their claiming. And even though now, of course, Al-Makki, Zitoun and other of their leaders are trying really to show that they will come up with something completely new. I don't trust them. I never trusted them since the 80s. I will continue. But I would say that let's not forget that the Muslim Brotherhood, when after Morsi and their own Murshid was in jail, they thought about Rashid al-Ghannouchi to become the new Murshid of all the Muslim Brotherhood. So no matter what they're claiming, the link is still there. And let's also not forget that despite the fact that Islam is a religion, it's not the governance cannot use it, but the problem is that it's still used, the Islamic Sharia, in all Arab countries except Tunisia, to really run family laws and to deny women's their rights based on their interpretation or understanding of Islam. And this is the huge problem. So even the countries who are not really facing the Muslim Brotherhood per se are still, their women are still being denied their rights. And I think this is something that we should always think about it and find the solution for that. Thank you very much.
That was such an important point. Yeah, that's so true.
Thank you very much. If we go to Mohamed for any closing thoughts to draw it together.
No, that was a very interesting point, and I thank you for that, Khadija. And I think I've learned a lot from yourself and from Hussein. And yeah, just thanks to everyone.
Thanks for being here. Khadija, did you have any further closing thoughts?
Thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity. Let's continue the fight, the good fight.
The good fight.
Indeed.
Yeah,
indeed.
now let's do that. I mean, look, this is not over, right? That's the Brotherhood and the Salafist Jihad, the political Islam in the Arab world right now is at a nadir. It's on its back, it's smoldering, it's crashed and burned because it had a chance, and it got revealed. The emptiness and the agenda, the bad qualities of the agenda got revealed. But I still think that the fact that the grievances that gave them the opportunity in 2010, 2011, 2012 have not been addressed means that it remains a threat. All kinds of demagoguery, all kinds of populism, all kinds of lowest common denominator politics that you can use to whip people and get them into the streets and support some kind of dictator or some kind of a radical movement because they are angry and they are broke and they are hungry and they have nowhere to go and no way to keep authority in a rule of law. Well, under such circumstances, even a discredited movement could come back. Even a discredited ideology can come back. And this remains a potent weapon. So I agree with my colleagues. This is, you know, it's still a ticking time bomb. It's just right now, the fuse is very, very long at this point, but it hasn't been disarmed, yeah?
And I want to add one last thing, and I think this is the point I'd like to make as someone in his early 30s that has a lot of sort of friends and family that are roughly my age. I think Islamist groups and jihadist groups have done more to turn the younger millennials and Generation Zs from Islam than sort of any other factor, whether it's globalization or immigration, etc. And I think that paradox will be the greatest paradox of Islam in the 20th and 21st century. That sort of younger millennials and Gen Zs and Generation Alphas, as they call the new ones, have become agnostics and atheists. And obviously, everyone's completely free to believe or not to believe. But it's because of these groups that seek to represent Islam and want to do what's best for Islam that are resulted in the complete opposite effect. And I think that's something that's quite important for us all to note.
Thank you. I hope we'll pick all these topics up at some point together again soon. I'll be back with another webinar next month. Thank you everybody for being here. It was a great talk from all of you. I will see you again soon.
What a pleasure. Thank you so much, Flor.
Thank you.
Thank you to both my colleagues.
Bye.
Bye bye. Have a good day.
You too.